A hot night in the city, a gas station, and an ordinary black woman, until a suspicious police officer decides to draw his gun. What he didn't know was that she wasn't who he imagined. When she reveals her FBI badge, everything changes in seconds. What seemed like yet another abuse of authority turns into a shocking turn of events. In 5 minutes, the story takes a surprising turn, and the consequences for the police officer are more serious than he could have ever predicted. Want to know what happened? Watch until the end. But first, check if it is already written on the channel, so you don't miss any videos. A warm night, the neon lights flashing in the distance, the distant noise of cars rushing down the road. In the parking lot of a gas station, movement was routine. But something was about to happen. A black woman, well-dressed, with well-kept hair and elegance in every step, gets out of a car and starts looking at her cell phone. She is calm, absorbed by what she sees on the screen, without rushing. She doesn't notice that on the other side of the parking lot, a police officer is watching her with a penetrating gaze, as if he is analyzing her every move. The police officer, a man in uniform and with a rigid posture, begins to narrow his eyes. He watches the woman for a few seconds, thoughts running through his mind, something that doesn't feel right, a strange sensation that he can't ignore. He feels the tension building, the need to act, and something inside him, perhaps the arrogance of the position or the perception of control, makes him make a quick decision. He places his hand on his waist, where his gun rests, and his gaze settles on her. This doesn't feel right, he thinks, his eyes narrowing as he watches the woman. The instinct for authority, fed by the routine of his work, drives him to act. Something in him feels like something is wrong, a feeling he can't ignore. He observes her details, her relaxed posture, her calm gestures as she uses her cell phone, but something inside his cop brain clicks. He starts walking towards her, his heavy and firm steps echoing on the asphalt, breaking the silence of the night and making the hot air of the city feel even more heavy. Your shoes tap rhythmically, but with an intensity that reveals the discomfort and accumulated tension. He feels the adrenaline start to rise. Each movement seems charged with a purpose, as if the simple fact of approaching that woman was a matter of control. The headlights of nearby cars cast distorted shadows around, making the scene seem even more charged with tension. He observes that the woman does not notice his approach, completely absorbed in her cell phone, her fingers sliding across the screen almost automatically, oblivious to the police officer's growing presence. But suddenly, out of the blue, the policeman's voice cuts through the air like a sharp blade, breaking the tense silence that hovered between the two. "Hey, you there!" His voice is authoritative, a commanding tone that resonates in the room like an order. She looks up, surprised, interrupting her concentration on her cell phone. Her eyes meet the police officer, who is now right in front of her, with a rigid posture and hand already close to the gun. What seemed like a simple stop at the gas station now takes on a completely different tone. She looks up quickly, surprised. But before she can react, the officer is already close, his hand firmly on his gun, his gaze fixed on her relentlessly. He examines her as if he's seeing something she hasn't noticed in herself. His tone of voice is aggressive, without explanations. "What are you doing here? This is no place for you to hang around." She frowns, not understanding the accusation. The atmosphere is calm, and nothing about her suggests that she should be approached so abruptly. She looks at the police officer, trying to understand the reason for his approach. "And do you think the police acted correctly or exaggerated? Comment yes or no." "Sorry, officer, I'm just going to pay for the gas. Any problems?" But the policeman doesn't listen to her, or rather, he chooses not to listen. He has already made his decision, and the inner voice that drives him through. His routine of authority now dominates his actions. He goes into control mode, a mindset he knows well, and his body tenses like a spring about to snap. His tone hardens, and he approaches even closer, his heavy and determined footsteps drowning out any sound around him. The movement is calculated. His presence seems to grow with each step. The tension in the air is palpable, the heat of the night now mixed with the electricity of an imminent confrontation. The silence that surrounds them is broken only by the sounds of tires on nearby asphalt and the police officer's heavy breathing, which comes out of his lungs with a rapidity that betrays his growing discomfort. Document, now. I want to know who you are and why you are here. The words fall heavy, as if they carried the weight of an unquestionable order. The command resounding in the stillness of the night is felt in every syllable, his voice like a stroke of authority that reverberates between the columns of the empty gas station. People around start to notice the interaction. Some onlookers stop halfway, others discreetly move away, but no one dares to interfere. The presence of the police officer, intense and impersonal, dominates the space. Some eyes are fixed on the scene, but most choose to observe from a distance, aware of the tension in the air. The woman, although visibly surprised and disconcerted, remains calm. She's experienced enough to know that any sudden movement or impulsive reaction can be taken the wrong way, and she doesn't want to give him any more reason to act out. Your mind works fast, evaluating every word and every step he takes. She lets out a short breath, trying to maintain control of the situation, feeling the weight of the moment. Officer, tell me what the suspect is. Is there something illegal going on? The question comes out of her without hesitation, her voice firm but not challenging. She simply seeks to understand the basis of what is happening, trying to alleviate the situation with a direct approach. However, the answer doesn't come. The silence is dense and full of tension. He doesn't seem to bother clarifying. His stance only becomes more rigid. His eyes narrow menacingly as he stares at the woman with a look of disdain. The police officer doesn't like her answer. He sees her calmness as an affront, an attempt to divert the situation from his authority. His fingers touch the butt of the gun. The movement is slow, deliberate, and the threat, although subtle, is clear. The sound of his finger pressing on. The gun's metal echoes like a warning, but what's most disturbing is the way he keeps his gaze fixed on her, as if he's waiting for a mistake, a justification to act. His hand is close, very close to the trigger. He takes a step forward, closing the distance between them even further. The air becomes thick, difficult to breathe. Every inch he advances makes the space between them almost unbearable, as if time is stretching out, creating a tension that will only be resolved with imminent action. The woman senses the danger. She feels the pressure increasing and, with a firm look, decides not to submit. She observes the police officer, now with an even more aggressive stance, and feels the atmosphere intensifying with each second. I'm not a threat. You're pointing your gun at the wrong person. The policeman laughs, a dry, dismissive laugh. He doesn't believe her words. Your mind has already been made up. Oh, yeah? Because from my perspective, you're acting like someone with something to hide. He responds, as if it were a definitive sentence with no room for questioning. The tension in the scene is intense, and in one swift movement, the officer's hand moves to the gun on his belt, fingers ready to pull the trigger at any moment. At that moment, the air seems to stop. The people around, now completely alert, start recording with their cell phones. The sound of a camera clicking echoes like a trademark of a moment that will probably change everything. The woman takes a deep breath, controlling the anxiety that begins to take over her body. She can't make mistakes. With a calm, deliberate movement, she places her hand inside her blazer. The police officer, seeing the movement, takes a step forward, ready to react, his fingers almost touching the trigger, the tension in the air like a blade about to cut. The crowd approaches silently, with cell phones now filming every second of the interaction. But what she takes away, what she holds tightly in her hands, changes everything. The atmosphere, which was once charged with hostility, is now about to be turned upside down. The police officer, not knowing what to expect, watches with a fixed and suspicious gaze. What the woman took out of her blazer is not what he imagined. The metallic sheen reflecting the light from the gas station is not a weapon, but something he could never have predicted. And at that moment, the dynamics of power and tension that had been building for minutes completely fell apart. Slowly, with a firm and precise hand, she pulls out a metallic object from inside her jacket. The silver glow of the FBI badge reflects the light from the gas station lamps, like lightning cutting through the darkness. The sound of sirens and the distant murmur of traffic become muffled, as if time has slowed down for an instant. FBI Special Agent, drop that weapon now. His voice is firm, with no room for doubts or negotiations. Each word weighs heavily, loaded with authority. The officer, still with his gun partially raised, blinks in surprise. He didn't expect this. What he sees before him is a calm woman, but with an unflappable confidence. He tilts his head slightly, staring at the badge for a second, as if trying to understand what's happening. But then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he laughs. FBI, you? He lets out a mocking laugh, shakes his head, still doubting what he's seeing. Oh, that's a good one. Where did you get this from? Did you buy it online? The crowd around begins to increase. People get out of their cars, curious, attracted by the tension that spreads through the environment. The man who was recording with his cell phone comes closer, his camera now focusing intensely on the scene, as if he knew this was going to be something big. The woman keeps her gaze fixed, her body erect, and her posture unwavering, a direct contrast to the mocking attitude of the police officer. Last chance, officer. Put away that weapon and think carefully about your next move. She speaks with a calm that cuts the air, without hesitation. His voice is a subtle but palpable threat. But the policeman is not intimidated. He doesn't move. He doesn't back down. On the contrary, he crosses his arms, gives an exaggerated sigh and smiles, convinced that he is in control of the situation. Do you know what I think? He says, completely ignoring the badge now. That you are lying. The woman doesn't respond. Your eyes, however, speak more than 1,000 words. She's not there to argue. She knows exactly what's going on. The police officer just made a mistake that he cannot correct. You are interfering with the work of a federal agent. His voice is even firmer now, without traces of doubt. This is the last time I will warn you. He doesn't listen. On the contrary, he still feels in control. With a cynical smile, he puts his hands on his belt again, closer to his gun. Okay, I understand, he says disdainfully, turning his face to the audience. Do you think that because you rehearsed some authoritative phrases, I will believe it? He smiles once again, arrogantly. I can arrest you right now for contempt. The tension in the air is palpable. The audience murmurs as the man with the camera records every second. The woman remains unshakable, unresponsive, her eyes still, fixed on the police officer. The moment is at its limit, and no one knows what will happen next. And then, the unexpected happens. Mermaids, the sharp sound cuts through the air, and the policeman turns around, visibly confused. He looks around, still not understanding. 2 patrol cars suddenly appear, their lights flashing frantically, illuminating the scene and increasing the tension even more. The policeman frowns, not knowing what to do. He looks at the cars, then at the woman. The situation is already out of control, and he still doesn't realize it. The confusion grows, and then everything falls apart. The patrol. Cars rumble to a halt, and the doors open quickly. 2 police officers rush out. One of them, a more experienced sergeant, looks directly at the woman and freezes. He recognizes something but can't believe what he's seeing. Oh no, he murmurs, unable to believe it. The other police officer looks at the scene and immediately realizes that it is about to explode. He sees the gun almost drawn, the FBI agent with her badge in hand, and the crowd now recording everything. He knows that something serious is happening, and that everything could get out of control. What is happening here? The sergeant advances quickly, his voice tense and serious. The police officer who started it all doesn't even move, still maintaining his arrogant, although clearly uncomfortable, posture. He crosses his arms and, with a disdainful gesture, points his chin at the woman. "We caught an imposter here, Sergeant. He's trying to pose as a federal agent. If this happened to you, how would you react? Write in the comments." The sergeant, in disbelief, takes a step back, still processing. The words, "How is it?" The woman, without changing her expression, takes a step forward, keeping the badge visible, without moving back. "My name is Agent's name. I'm a special agent with the FBI. This man pulled a gun on me without justification and ignored my identification." The sergeant, now completely pale, finally understands the gravity of the situation. He's heard her name before. He knows who she is. The silence that follows is deafening. And then the tone of the conversation changes completely. What seemed like a common situation of abuse of authority turns into something much more serious. The sergeant swallows hard. The agent's name reverberates in her mind, heavy and impossible to ignore. Agent name. He has heard that name in countless meetings, in joint operations, and respect for her has always been clear among his colleagues. But now, there before his eyes, is one of his own police officers about to make the worst mistake of his career, a mistake that cannot be undone. The sergeant slowly turns to the attacking police officer, who is still wearing a smug smile, not realizing the gravity of what he has just done. The officer, ignoring the growing tension, appears to believe he is in control, as if nothing there is real. "Did you check her identity?" the sergeant asks, his voice tense, more serious than the officer expected. Every word he says is charged with the sense of impending error. The police officer, with arrogance still on his face, shrugs, indifferent to what is happening around him. "I told you, Sergeant. That could be false. These people buy fake badges all the time." He speaks with the certainty of someone who doesn't understand the magnitude of what he's saying, still trying to justify his attitude as if it were normality in his routine. The growing murmur among the surrounding spectators begins to intensify. People are now paying attention, cell phones continue to record, and eyes turn to the police officer. The man with the camera moves even closer, capturing every expression on the officer's face. The sergeant, exhaling a heavy sigh, feels the pressure increase. He looks directly at the FBI agent, who remains implacable and dignified, as if she knows exactly what is going on. "Allow me to check your badge, Agent." The sergeant asks, his voice now softer but full of respect. He knows that the situation is about to escalate, and the game has turned irreversibly. The FBI woman, without hesitation, holds out her badge. She knows that her authority has already been unfairly questioned, but at this moment, she is just waiting for the outcome. The sergeant takes the badge and looks at it for a second. He turns it over in his hands, examining it carefully. He knows there is no doubt about its authenticity, but he needs to confirm it. With an automatic gesture, he picks up the radio on his shoulder and makes the call. His voice now deep and authoritative. "Central, confirm the identity of the agent. Agent name, registration number. XXXXX." He speaks with precision, each word loaded with seriousness. The silence around you is deafening. The answer comes almost instantly, with no room for questioning. "Confirmed, Sergeant. Agent name, is an active FBI officer." The confirmation sounds like a blow, and the sergeant closes his eyes for a brief moment. He knew, but he needed to hear it. He needed official confirmation to make sure the gravity of the situation was fully understood. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, begins to realize that his actions are being taken seriously. The weight of the mistake he made begins to fall on his shoulders, but he's not yet ready to accept the consequences. The sergeant turns slowly and looks at the police officer with an expression that mixes disappointment and disbelief. "Tell me you didn't pull your gun on a federal agent." The sergeant's voice is almost a whisper, but full of contained anger. He can hardly believe what he is hearing and seeing. The policeman's smile finally disappears. He feels the weight of silence, the weight of truth. His body tense. The confidence he once had now seems to melt. He tries to find a way out, but it's too late. The sergeant takes another step forward, his presence imposing. The tension in the air is palpable, and all eyes turn to the officer, waiting for his answer. "Tell me you did not point a gun at a federal agent, officer." The sergeant's voice is firm and cold, with no room for doubt. The question is a sentence in itself. The police officer who once exuded arrogance and certainty now appears weaker. He swallows hard. Sweat starts to run down his forehead. His eyes move frantically around, seeking support from somewhere. He looks at the audience, at the cell phones recording, and sees the judgment in their eyes. The arrogant smile he wore just a few minutes ago has now completely disappeared. I thought she was lying," he says, his voice now shaking. The excuse seems pathetic, but he can no longer maintain his pride. He realizes that he is alone, completely isolated. The sergeant closes his eyes for a brief second, as if he wants to reverse time, as if he could change everything that happened, but it's already too late. You ignored a legitimate federal badge, drew your gun on an FBI agent, and further mocked her authority. And that? The sergeant now speaks with a contained but no less intense anger. He can't hide his disappointment, and his tone echoes the gravity of the situation. The police officer tries to maintain his stance, but each word from the sergeant destroys him a little more. "I just did what any cop would do, Sergeant. I saw a suspect acting strange and—" The police officer tries to justify his actions, but the sergeant's interruption is immediate, cutting off any chance of defense. "Suspicion." The sergeant interrupts in disbelief, his voice now full of indignation. "You didn't even bother to check before pulling out your gun?" The sergeant's tone is a mixture of anger and disappointment. The police officer now feels the weight of his words, the lack of sense and judgment. The audience murmurs, and the tension in the scene reaches its peak. The police officer, seeing that his error is being publicly exposed, feels increasingly small. I may have gotten ahead of myself." He admits, his voice now almost inaudible, without conviction. His posture, which was once one of superiority, is now completely overturned. The FBI agent, arms crossed, watches with a serious, unwavering expression. "You didn't rush. You abused your authority," she states, without hesitation. Every word is a condemnation, and the police officer, now without answers, looks at the sergeant, hoping for some kind of support. But all he gets is a look of pure disappointment. Silence takes over the scene for a moment, until the sergeant, with the gravity of the situation in his eyes, drops the bomb that changes everything. "You're suspended, officer, and we will launch an investigation into your conduct." The policeman cannot believe what he hears. He tries to protest, but he already knows there is no going back. The damage is done. "Officer," last name, "surrender your weapon and badge. Now." "Satindi." Sergeant's tone is as firm as the authority he wields, and the words cut through the air like a blade. The police officer's face, which was once full of confidence, now contorts into a red hue of anger and disbelief. "What?" he exhales, surprise and panic beginning to overflow in his voice. The arrogance he displayed seconds ago begins to crumble in the face of the gravity of the situation. His eyes widen, and he takes a step back, as if trying to escape a reality he can't understand. But the sergeant, without any sign of mercy or hesitation, already raises his hand to another officer at his side. The gesture is short, precise, and, without words, the other police officer advances towards the attacker. "Handcuff him!" For abuse of authority and improper conduct, the order is given with the precision of a captain on a battlefield, and the effect is immediate. The air around seems to stop. The silence that follows weighs like lead, thick and suffocating. The police officer stares at the sergeant, his eyes now empty of trust, as he tries to understand that what has just happened there is no going back. His eyes widen, his jaw clenched, his hands shaking involuntarily. Panic begins to take over. "Sergeant, that's a mistake. I am one of you." He tries uselessly to justify his arrogance. The same arrogance that made him ignore his FBI badge. The same that made him disrespect a federal agent with a mocking smile. But the sergeant doesn't want to hear excuses. He has already decided what to do. Without wasting a second, the sergeant nods, and the officer assigned to handcuff him advances. The tension in the scene is palpable. The crowd watches, silent, as the attacker begins to realize there is no escape. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the sergeant orders, with an uncompromising tone. The policeman hesitates. He looks at his colleagues in uniform, seeing their indifference. He watches the cell phones which continue to film, and the FBI woman, who is now watching him with a cold, implacable gaze, as if she knew exactly what would happen next. She is distant, but her presence there is like a reflection of the truth that the police officer can no longer deny. With one last sigh, the police officer, now completely defeated, turns around. He knows what comes next, but his resistance is minimal. He tries one more time in a last gasp of dignity that no longer makes sense. "I can explain." His voice breaks, and he knows there are no more possible explanations. Clack! The sound of the handcuffs closing is thunderous. It is definitive, like a sentence. The noise echoes down the street, and the pressure on the officer's shoulders increases. The handcuffs tighten, making it impossible to escape, physically and emotionally. He feels the weight of his failure in his flesh, as if it were another scar in his life that cannot be erased. The arrogant smile disappears from his face, and true shame consumes him. The police officer now walks with heavy steps, led to the police car. His face, once radiant with confidence, is now pale, completely devoid of the authoritative posture he believed he had. He is no longer the same man. The contrast between the imposing figure he tried to portray and the humiliation he is about to experience is brutal. The FBI agent maintains a firm posture, but her eyes, now softer, reveal a mixture of disappointment and tiredness. She's seen this happen before many times. This is not a victory, but a small fix to a system that fails frequently. She doesn't feel anger, just the coldness of someone who has faced this kind of disrespect more times than they should. The sergeant lets out a heavy sigh, tension visible on his face. He watches the officer being placed in the squad car and feels the gravity of what has just occurred. "You didn't just make a serious mistake, last name. You embarrassed us," he says with regret, looking directly at the police officer, who is now just a shadow of who he believed to be a colleague in uniform. The police officer is taken to the police car, and the crowd, who continued recording every second, watches the outcome. The scenario that seemed normal minutes before is now forever etched in the memory of everyone present. The sirens, which once seemed a mere part of the background, now echo in their hearts, a constant reminder that power must never be misused. As the police car drives away, leaving the gas station behind, the city returns to its apparent normality. But the tension in the air doesn't disappear. The image of the police officer handcuffed and being taken to the squad car will be engraved in the minds of everyone who was there. No matter where he goes, his name will be remembered, and not in a positive way. The FBI agent watches the cars drive away for a moment, and then her eyes turn to the sergeant. He looks at her now with a look of respect, and she notices the almost imperceptible sign of apology he offers, a silent and humble gesture. "Thank you, Sergeant," she says firmly but without bitterness. "It was nothing, Agent. It's not your fault. He was the one who did it." The sergeant responds with the sincerity of someone who knows there is no going back to what happened. The agent looks at her cell phone, which is still recording the scene, and a slight smile forms on her lips. She knows what will happen next. The video is already circulating on social media and going viral at a frightening rate. Within hours, the case will be the center of attention, and the attacking police officer will face not only public humiliation, but investigation for abuse of authority. As the video gains traction, comments explode. Structural racism and abuse of power are addressed by millions, with many expressing outrage at the treatment of a black woman with an FBI badge, and others reflecting on how black women face this type of abuse constantly. The impact is immediate, and the damage to the police officer is irreparable. Meanwhile, the FBI agent, without losing her composure, continues her night. She returns to her work, aware that this battle, at least, has been won. But she knows that the fight against prejudice and abuse of authority is a long path, full of obstacles that goes far beyond this single night. The last image of the video shows the agent calmly walking back to her car as the crowd disperses and sirens echo in the distance. She no longer needs to prove anything. She knew from the beginning that true justice does not depend on applause, but on silent and correct actions. And so, the story that began with abuse of power and arrogance ends with a small but meaningful reparation. A reparation that will not solve all problems, but is an important step for those who dare to face injustice. Have you ever witnessed or been a victim of something similar? Share your experience in the comments. If you were shocked by what you just saw, be sure to like and share this video. And to see more impactful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here you find what really matters. Don't miss the next story. Sign up now.